Yeah, hey everyone. So for today's topic and the next couple of topics associated with this series, we're going to be talking about Linux, so specifically Linux and Linux with Boomi. So before we get to Boomi, we first have to understand what Linux is, why it's used, and why we should use it for our Boomi environment. From there, we'll get into the different parts of Linux. We'll play around with different Linux distributions. We'll talk about what that means and items of that sort to ensure you're comfortable with Linux and specifically operating, maintaining, and managing your Linux Boomi environment. So, with that said, first point is, well, what is Linux and why is it so popular? So Linux, similar to Mac OS or Windows, it's an operating system. Um, this is not going to span what an operating system is. I assume you already know what an operating system is and what it does. We'll talk about Linux as an operating system in a future slide deck. But basically, the point in Linux as an operating system is it's free and it's open source. So by open source, people can make changes to it, redistribute, make copies of those changes, items of that sort, which is pretty powerful. Linux powers a ton of enterprise software, a lot of the World Wide Web actually. And in addition to that, the stock exchange and Android are both powered by Linux. Fun fact. So I talked before about the different flavors or distributions of Linux. So a couple examples here are Red Hat, Ubuntu. You've probably heard of those. So your next question may be, well, what really is a distribution and flavor? Why are there different flavors of Linux? So we talked about Windows. Windows, obviously, pretty synonymous with Microsoft. So their code, their operating system code, is closed source, meaning not everyone can access it. So basically, they package all the Windows dependencies for that operating system into some sort of like supported release that you can then download from their website. Linux being open source, basically there's a distribution of all the different parts of Linux. So the operating system, GPU, like basically anything you're using with Linux is open source. So basically, the point in a distribution like Red Hat, Ubuntu, they're going to take all these parts for you and distribute it and combine them, which is pretty powerful. So each distribution flavor really has their own preferences. So, for example, if you're using it for a desktop, what's the default browser? What's the default theme look of it? If you're using it for a CLI, what's the default package manager? We'll talk about that once we get to it. Items of that sort that you can modify, but the same architecture, same underlying OS code is Linux code. I mentioned Red Hat and Ubuntu because they do come out with security patches, updates, and whatnot pretty often. And they're more enterprise esque, being they're constantly updated. There's a pretty powerful community for it and items of that sort. So, next question is, well, why should I be using Linux in my Boomi environment versus Windows? I'm assuming you know that we support Linux and Windows as operating systems for your Atom Cloud molecule. So it was a product decision to determine that Linux is actually the recommended operating system to run the Boomi application in production. And there's a couple reasons for that. One is the notorious no class def found class cast esque exception, thread stacks. Basically, how that works is a JVM, so your molecule or cloud. It's typically in clustered runtimes. So it tries to access some sort of jar file from the file share at runtime, being the Java class loader loads these jar files dynamically. And for one reason or another, it can't access it, can't grab a lock to it, and then it continuously prints this no class def found error until the application is restarted. So a couple reasons we've seen for that: backups, antivirus, and DFS. We've seen problems with all three, specifically in Windows. So obviously, if you see no class, you may have to remove your backup, antivirus software, DFS. Or if you're taking some sort of backup, you may have to restart the file share in the application, i.e. downtime. Removing DFS as well removes the high availability of a clustered backend file system. So obviously some concerns with that. Um, just another reason the Windows operating system, just because of how it works and how it was designed, consumes more resources and memory when compared to Linux. Linux is known with its open source code to be very low on memory. It really uses no memory, which is pretty powerful. So it's a lot easier to run several applications without the operating system eating up resources. Boomi specifically, my third point, supports containerization in Linux. So I mean Docker, Kubernetes. Currently, there's no support for these items in Windows, and most of the containerization use cases and reference architectures will surround Linux in the future. Another item, as a member of the technical architecture team, one of our colleagues did some testing with spinning up threads in a JVM, and threading was much quicker. So spinning up threads in a JVM was a lot quicker in Linux, which is great for these high load, high processing, high document count use cases. Basically, what we saw in Windows is that it slowly went up to the thread number. So if it was 10, it slowly went up to 10. Versus Linux, you went basically from 0 to 10, which is pretty powerful as well. And thank you for that. And then for the next series of topics, as I mentioned, we'll be covering some of the command line tools, important concepts and terminologies to understand, and items of that sort. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.